Hi, and welcome to this live reading from Tears into Gold by Cori Cooper, and this is presented by Itsy Bitsy Book Bits. Prologue. The Lord and Lady Fitzgerald drove away from the manor house at precisely 7 o'clock in the evening with plans to return sometime the next morning. They were accompanied by their 3 horrible daughters, leaving the manor in the capable hands of their servants for a few blissful hours that stretched forward like a path paved with gold. Events such as Sir Langley's Midsummer's Eve ball had a way of running on ever since the king decreed it unfashionable to be the first to leave. Of all the decrees, this was his most ridiculous. A waste of parchment, really. Not that anyone was complaining. A night without the less tolerable members of the honorable family Fitzgerald was more valuable than pink diamonds and 3 times as rare. Only Oscar Fitzgerald, the eldest and heir, remained behind. Society made his ankles itch, and an evening with his scheming mother was equal in comfort to having a tooth pulled. He should have spent the evening alone in his room like a good fellow, but instead snuck away from his stuffy butler to infiltrate the kitchen. He'd pulled that same trick at least once a month since he was a small boy. Most of the servants barely noticed him anymore, and those who did couldn't blame him. Mama Cook made the best tarts in the 4 kingdoms. One would be a fool to miss the chance to sink their teeth into the flaky crust and creamy filling. And Oscar was no fool. When the clomping of horse hooves faded into the song of nightingales, Mama Cook gathered everyone around the kitchen fireplace. She'd already stoked a roaring fire that warmed to the tips of the toes. Branka, an orphaned scullery maid, tucked her skirts in tight and snuggled between Mama Cook and Sarah, the head of the laundry. The 2 older women smelled of yeast, soap, and something slightly tangy, like vinegar. Oscar sat at Branka's feet, leaning his back against her legs. He'd left his finery in his room and borrowed a tunic and leggings from Bernard, apprentice to the blacksmith, so that he might fit in better among the servants. There was a different feeling around him tonight. Oscar was pensive and distracted, where he was usually jovial. Branka thought she understood. What worked so well for a small boy was increasingly difficult for a young lord on the brink of manhood. The shift happened slowly, gradually, like a big ship heavy laden with precious gems. His title weighed heavy on him tonight. This was in part why Branka didn't ask him to move away, even though her feet had long since fallen asleep. He'd spent the evening thus far staring into the fire and giving her long, sad looks every time their eyes chanced to meet. Gerald, the bowman, produced a wild boar, and Mama Cook displayed her unmatched skill in dressing it. Gerald turned the boar slowly around the spit in the center of the kitchen, mesmerized by the rich smells and the sizzle of drippings. The only thing that could draw Branka's attention away from such delight was the sound of Drake, the storyteller, rubbing his hands together. Whenever Drake rubbed his hands together, a tale emerged. Branka leaned as far forward as she could without pitching face first into Oscar's lap. She wanted to be the first person the words reached when they left Drake's mouth. Once upon a time, on a night much like tonight, a young man by the name of Horatio— Why is you always telling tales with highbrow handles? For pity's sake, Drake, what's wrong with the name John? Bernard interrupted immediately. It was what he always did. For some reason, he thought a story was improved by much speaking, and it was, just not when Bernard was the one doing the speaking. During winter solstice, Bernard had gone on a whispered tirade about heroines with long flowing locks of golden hair. It was so distracting, Branka missed Drake's entire tale that night. She'd learned her lesson, though, and this evening chose the seat as far from Bernard as possible. Heidi elbowed Bernard to get him to hush. A dirty look was all she got for her troubles. Oscar was the one to respond. Maybe people with the name John never do anything worthy of a tale. Did you think of that? Bernard's eyebrows wiggled inward. He opened his mouth to argue. It was so very hard for him to let things go. At this rate, they would never finish the story, and Branka would have to lie awake all night trying to figure out what was supposed to happen. She wished for a bundle of rags to stuff in his mouth. Thankfully, Mama Cook intervened. Shush you! She waved her flour towel in the air. Tiny sugar grains glittered above the roasting boar like the dust of fairies. That was all the encouragement Bernard needed to close his mouth and allow Drake to go on. Our friend Horatio remembered a tale from his youth about Midsummer's Eve. It haunted him for many months as an idea slowly formed in his mind. His father told him of the Fairy Queen, the ruler of all the Fae. She will emerge from her flower mound once a year for only one night and grant a wish to one mortal. Horatio knew there were many mortals who would leave the safety of the fairy rings and venture into the forest, but he was sure none were as desperate as he. He was in desperate need of a wish. Why? Margaret asked with big eyes. She always wanted to know the end from the beginning. Several others groaned and waved their hands to shush her now. Branka couldn't blame Margaret for asking, not really. Why was a question she was very familiar with. Most days she was happy and content with her lot, but there were times when the future stretched onward like a barren desert. When helplessness overwhelmed her, Branka would give every feather in her pillow to know why fate had sent her to the Fitzgerald manor to a life of drudgery and dirt, with no hope. No, indeed, Branka did not blame Margaret for wanting to know why. Drake just smiled mysteriously, and after a long pause, he continued his tale. Horatio left the manor where he cared for the horses. Like me, Leaf raised his hand. Like you, Drake nodded. But, unlike you, Horatio left the manor and walked to the edge of the land where a circle of salt as thick as my arm created a barrier. He lifted his leg to step over the salt. His boot hovered in the air, shaking with the effort it took to push it toward the ground outside the protective circle. The wind whipped his cap from his head and flung it back toward the house. He thought he heard the word, don't. Horatio stepped backward away from the salt and stared at the forest. Tall trees like sentinels created a barrier to the dark interior. He looked over his shoulder at his hat twirling toward the back door of the manor house. Forward was hardship and uncertainty. Backward was hardship and heartache. He would take the uncertainty any day. Horatio gritted his teeth and placed his foot firmly on the other side of the salt circle. There was no wind to deter him this time. It had blown away to bother another. He took long strides away from the house and never once looked back. The moon lit the way, and before long, Horatio's feet found a path of unnaturally white toadstools that gleamed iridescent like fresh pearls. They appeared in front of him every time he took a step. He glanced behind and saw them slip back into the ground as soon as he passed. It was a sign, he was certain. The Fairy Queen was guiding him. She had chosen him. The natural noises of the night faded into the background as Horatio focused all his energy on those toadstools. He was afraid to even blink. What if he missed one and they disappeared forever? This was his one chance. He could not lose it. What happened next? Margaret gripped Jane's hand so tightly the tips of both their fingers were white. Well, Horatio traveled by toadstool for a good part of the night. The forest enveloped him so thoroughly that he no longer knew which way was forward and which was behind. It didn't bother him while he had the toadstools to light his path. Only when they disappeared suddenly did he begin to think he'd made a horrible mistake. Bernard snorted. I could have told him that. Oscar elbowed Branka's shin. He loved it when Bernard got all worked up about things that weren't real. She grinned and ruffled his hair. Go on, Heidi shushed Bernard with a glare. Finish the story. Drake winked at Bernard. Horatio looked around. The toadstool stopped at a hedge. It was a whole head taller than himself. He could not see through it. He could not dig under it. It was too high to peer over. When he jumped, it seemed to rise with him. Horatio wove his hand through the brambles, trying to find a way through, but the hedge grew tight together and clung to itself. The only reward he received for his efforts were light pink scratches all the way to his elbows. Horatio looked up at the sky. Perhaps the moon would help him. Surely she could see a way. She had followed him through the forest all this time, winking down through gaps in the trees. As he peered skyward, he noticed the tree branches hanging over the hedge. He would climb a tree near the hedge and let himself down on the other side. That just might work. Maybe if he had a better name, he wouldn't be so dumb. Bernard crossed his arms. Fool should have never left the protection of the yard. Yeah, but then there wouldn't be a story, Leaf countered. Several in the circle nodded and made noises of agreement. Branka was one of them. Thank the heavens for Horatio and his lack of sense. Because of him and others like him, there was more to Branka's life than dirt and commands. "Oh, let him finish, please." Margaret could barely contain herself. "I must know what happens next." Drake was happy to comply. Unfortunately for Horatio, the tree nearest the hedge would not be climbed. Neither would the tree next to the first, nor the third tree, nor the fourth tree. They skirted his fingers in the darkness. There was not a tree in the vicinity of the hedge that would allow Horatio to climb its limbs. When he reached for a branch, it was somehow a foot higher than he first perceived. When he finally grasped one, it grew so slippery he couldn't keep it in his hand. When he begged and then cried, the trees only laughed, shaking their branches so that leaves rained down on his head. That might have been the end of our friend Horatio, if not for the wisp. As he languished on the ground, his face in his hands, Horatio noticed a light. When he looked up, there was nothing but darkness until it reappeared as a slight gleam. Horatio scrambled to his feet and ran after the light. It bounced and rolled like a candle in a drafty room, but it never went out, and it never left the hedge. Horatio gasped for breath, but refused to stop as long as the wisp was in sight. High-pitched voices giggled around him, sometimes mocking, sometimes scornful. Horatio heeded them not. After what felt like an eternity, the wisp stopped. It bobbed in the wind. Horatio skidded to a halt and waited. After a few moments, the wisp turned to its side so that the tip of its head pointed towards the hedge. "Do I go through, then?" Horatio asked the wisp. There was no answer, not in words, but a strange thing happened to Horatio's feet. Of their own accord, they turned and took him to the hedge, and they did not stop there. Onward they went, pushing through the hedge itself. He lifted his arms to shield his face from the thorny branches. He closed his eyes so that they would not be gouged. He lowered his head and prepared for ripping and tearing, none of which came to pass. Horatio passed through the hedge the way he would pass through an open door. When he dared to open his eyes, the sight filled him with awe. There, in the center of a circle of dancing fairies, was a throne made from twisted vines and pink roses. On the throne sat a woman so beautiful, Horatio had to blink many times to get his eyes to adjust. "Oh, that's how Bernard feels about the pig girl over yonder. You know, the last I mean, Augusta, one of the new footmen smirked." Ulysses, his name was. "Shut your trap!" Bernard balled his fists. Mama Cook raised a rolling pin. "None of that, boys. Sit you down and hush." They did, though Bernard continued to glare in a way that would make Branka afraid to fall asleep tonight if she were the new footman. "You go on now." Mama Cook waved a rolling pin at Drake, who bowed his head. The woman stood when Horatio stepped forward. She held out her arms to welcome him as though prepared for an embrace. In reverence, Horatio moved to the edge of the circle and stopped. His feet would not let him step through the dancing fairies, who still whirled and leaped as if he were not even there. No matter how hard he willed himself to move forward, Horatio could do nothing but stand there, feeling large and stupid. She seemed to understand him without words. She asked what he wanted. Now that he was here, Horatio's thoughts were thick as molasses taffy, all stuck together in his mind. Wishes, he thought. Tell her you want wishes. With great effort, he pushed the words through the muck and blurted them so loudly the fairies finally stopped their dancing. They clutched their hands and stared at him. Horatio went cold. "You have come to ask me for wishes." The fairy queen lifted one white eyebrow. Horatio felt like he had tracked mud across a white marble floor. All he could do was nod. The fairy queen lowered herself onto her throne, her head now too heavy to hold up straight. "And how many wishes do you require?" Horatio's sluggish mind could not fathom her question. How many wishes did he want? How many would she give him? 10? 100? Thousands? "Choose any number." The fairy queen waved her hand gracefully through the air. "The first number that comes to your mind. Say it now." 3. Horatio blurted, and then he wanted to kick himself in the hind end. Sarah giggled. The fairy queen offered him anything he wanted, and he asked for 3 wishes. How could he be so daft? Drake pressed his lips together. He may regret the words, but Horatio could not take them back. There's magic in words. Binding magic. Horatio could not make the fairy queen unhear what she had heard. 3 wishes it is, then. Granted. The fairy queen waved her hand, and the circle of fairies disappeared, along with herself and the throne. Horatio blinked and found himself on the edge of the master's land, beside the circle of salt. The sun peeked over the roof of the house, blinding him. Horatio did not lift his hand to shield his eyes. He did not notice the sun or anything else. His mind could not grasp what had happened to him. Did he really journey to the center of the forest? Was he really the master of 3 wishes? It clicked into place like the buckle of a saddle. He was saved. He was the master of his own fate now. If he wished, he could make himself the lord of the manor. He could boss the servants and the animals. He could claim the land and the title. Hear, hear! Roderick raised his glass, earning a disapproving glare from Mama Cook. Drake eyed him. You may think it tempting to trade places with another laddie. Heed my words. This life is trouble. All around. Not one of us escapes it. Yah! Bernard slapped his knee. But I sure would rather have the trouble of riches and power than the trouble of scraping by. The stable boys and footmen stomped their feet and hooted. Branka hated to agree with them when she saw the disappointed look on Drake's face, not to mention Mama Cook, but she couldn't help thinking that they were right. Drake drew a deep sigh and let it out while the noise faded away. There was something Horatio wanted even more than riches and power, a desire so strong it robbed him of hunger and kept him awake at night. What was it? Margaret's sister Jane rubbed goosebumps on her arms. Freedom, Branka thought. It had to be freedom. That was the very thing that robbed her of sleep and took away her appetite. Love, Drake spoke in a harsh whisper, from the master's daughter. Oscar shifted. Love? Branka curled her lip. What was that to freedom? It'd be different if a person could choose who they loved, despite birth and title, but in a world such as hers, love was bondage. I knew it! Margaret's eyes opened even wider. He's in love with the master's daughter. Of course, that explains everything. No wonder. She patted Jane's arm with a satisfied air. Well, Drake looked at the ceiling thoughtfully. Perhaps he wanted a little revenge. Now, wait a moment. Sarah raised her hand. Revenge ain't a worthy cause. Why would the fairy lady give him wishes if revenge was what he really wanted? Drake opened his mouth to answer, but Samuel was quicker. Revenge can be worthy. See, take a man who's lost everything from some wrong dealing. It would be all right for him to expose the villain who wronged him. It would be just. I don't know. Sarah shook her long brown curls. That don't feel right to me. Perhaps, Branka cleared her throat and spoke louder. Perhaps the story will explain. Yes, let me finish, Margaret begged. Drake waited until they were quiet enough that they could hear the crickets chirping outside. As much as Horatio loved the master's daughter, he hated the master with all his heart. He envied the man. He envied his life. It was not fair that some would have so much and others so little based on a chance of birth. It could have been him with wealth and titles. It should have been him, and it would be. His wishes could make him master. Oh, he told himself he did not want it for himself alone. He wished to change the lives of his fellow servants too, give them all a chance to decide who they would be despite their lack of rank and birthright. Leaf's eyes lit up. It's not no love story at all, then. It's a vengeance, Oscar said. That's the thing, a vengeance story. I like love stories better, Jane shivered. What's the master's daughter's name, anyhow? Her name was... Drake paused to give Bernard a look. Esmeralda. Bernard sighed heavily. Esmeralda had no rival for beauty, talent, and grace. She was the bright sun in the darkness of Horatio's days, and he could not go on without her. He thought perhaps she cared for him in return. She was kind to him when their paths crossed, sometimes even tender. Despite all his years of hard work for her father, Horatio knew he wasn't enough to win her hand. He didn't have the respect of the master or the means to provide for her, but he was certain none could love her the way he did. That was why he needed wishes. Now that she was of age, Esmeralda entertained suitor after suitor from all over the 4 kingdoms, almost nightly. It nearly drove Horatio mad to see her talking, walking, and dancing with other men. He knew they only loved her for her wealth, but he also knew he didn't have a chance on his own. And now he had wishes, 3 of them. 3 wishes to change his fate. Without another thought, Horatio bounded across the yard to the front door of the manor house. He pushed the great door open and sauntered into the breakfast room where Esmeralda sat with her family. They all looked up when he entered the room, including the latest suitor, an earl from somewhere to the east. The smell of pudding and plums wafted from the table, reminding Horatio that he had not eaten in hours. The groan of his belly made a buzzing in his mind that would not quiet, no matter how diligently he tried to focus. I wish, he muttered, grasping for words. He must wish for something and do it quickly before the master could stand and issue the command to throw him out. He could see the impatience in the man's eyes. Everything else blurred into the shadows. The master would never give him a chance. He must speak. Horatio opened his mouth and bellowed, I wish Esmeralda would worship the ground at my feet. The master found his voice and demanded to know what this farm boy was doing in his dining hall. He yelled for guards to take him away, and he threw his spoon and then his napkin on the verge of a nice tantrum. Mama Cook chuckled. And then the master stopped. His mouth dropped into his chest. Esmeralda rose from her chair and fell to the ground at Horatio's feet, kissing it fervently. Horatio watched in confusion as she sang praises to the marble floor. Fool, he would have done better to wish for catnip, Bernard grumbled. Why is luck wasted on the daft? Drake went on as though nothing interrupted him. It didn't take long for Horatio to realize that his wish was taken literally, and Esmeralda was worshiping the ground at his feet, not him. In fact, she seemed to care nothing for him except that he stood upon the ground she loved. Filled with irritation, he tried again. I wish Esmeralda would love me this minute. Esmeralda rose to her feet, draped herself across Horatio's arm. My dearest, my sweet, I love you. I love you. Leaf made a gurgling sound in his throat. Just you wait, boy, Samuel ruffled his hair. You'll feel differently in a few years. Drake went on. Horatio enjoyed his success for exactly 1 minute. When that time ended, Esmeralda blinked and withdrew herself from Horatio as though he were something disgusting found on the barn floor. He reached for her, desperate to close the distance. Don't you love me? You must. I wish it until the end of time. She stepped even farther away and put her handkerchief to her nose. Horatio stamped his foot, quite angry. I wish for you to love me. She merely looked at him curiously. Horatio lowered his arms. Do you love me? Of course, Esmeralda said. Horatio reached for her, but she squealed and ran behind the suitor's chair. You said you love me, Horatio reminded her. And I do, Esmeralda said. I love all creatures of our God. That is not what I meant, Horatio stamped his foot again. In his fury, he did not notice the master's men gathering to seize his arms until it was too late to escape. All the way to the dungeon, he screamed. It wasn't fair. He cursed the fairies in the dark all alone until he yearned for the life he had before Midsummer's Eve. Drake leaned back and pulled a piece of straw from the bale to chew. And that is where we leave our friend Horatio, desperate and alone. So you see, the moral of this tale is simple. There's no point in wishing for something that just isn't. What? Margaret sat up. That's the end? It's not happy. Jane plopped her chin in her hand. Must it be happy? Drake asked with a teasing smile. Not all things in life are happy. No, Sarah agreed, but this is not life. This is a tale. It should end happily. Or it is so unsatisfying, Heidi added. What if it teaches a lesson? Drake threaded his fingers together. Is that happy? Mama Cook grunted her approval. But what lesson? Jean breathed. What can we learn from poor Horatio? Don't be an imbecile, Bernard suggested. Samuel shook his head. Don't mingle with fairies. That's it. That's got to be it. I don't understand something, Margaret said. Drake leaned forward. Yes? Well, why did the fairy queen give him a wish? Branka thought the story would tell, but I still don't know why the fairy queen helped him. She must have known he would waste her magic the way he did, because fairies know everything. Drake's eyes shifted to Branka then. What do you think? Did the story tell you why? Branka sat back and tapped her chin to help her think. Fairy Queen seemed disappointed when Horatio asked for wishes. That's right, Heidi sat up straight. She did. Why was she disappointed? All heads turned to Drake. He rubbed the stubble on his chin and looked at the ceiling for a moment. Well, I don't know exactly, but I heard a tale once that the Fairy Queen has everything anyone could ever want except for one thing. What? Jane leaned forward. What doesn't she have? Nothing. Bernard tugged his earlobe. Drake here's pulling both your legs. Fairies got magic, immortality, and they be beautiful. Humans are gnats like them that buzz around the barn. There is one thing. Drake raised a finger. I'm sure of it. Fairies don't feel love the way we do, and I think they want to. Maybe the Fairy Queen was disappointed because she thought Horatio came for her because he loved her. Oh, Branka nodded. That makes sense. And she twisted his wishes around and punished him because he was selfish. That's more like it, Leaf grinned. Revenge. Well, now, I still think the message is to stay away from fairies, Samuel rubbed his whiskers. That there is the beauty of a tale, Drake smiled. Everyone gets to decide what it means for them. You know, Roderick shouted, you shouldn't mess with wisps neither. They lead people to their death, I hear. Banshees do that too. And trolls. Don't mingle with witches. Or leprechauns. Yeah, leprechauns. Them are the worst. My uncle met one when he was a young man, and all he got for his trouble was the curse of barren farmland and sausage stuck to the end of his nose for the rest of his life. They will twist your words all around until nothing is left but a carcass like this here roasted boar. Speaking of this here boar, Gerald reached for a fork and poked the side. Done. Mama Cook passed around plates. The men and boys hung back while the women and the girls stood in the line for food. Mama Cook added heaping spoonfuls of golden roasted potatoes, green beans, cooked in butter, and a roll as fluffy as any cloud in the sky to each plate of meat. Branka sat back in her spot and balanced her full plate on her knee, but she didn't eat yet. Instead, she stared into the fire. What you thinking? Oscar kicked the side of her boot as he shuffled forward in line. She wrinkled her nose at him. Was wondering about the moral. What moral? Of the story? Oscar smiled. Drake gave you a moral. She shook her head. I don't care for that one. So you wish to change it, do you? What if there is no moral? What if it's just a story meant to entertain? Branka shrugged one shoulder and poked a small potato with her knife. It was so tender it broke apart into flaky cups. Steam warmed her face. I think there's something to learn from everything if we can see it. Everything? Bernard scratched his nose as he butted into the conversation. What's the moral in pig manure? Branka tipped her head to look at the stone ceiling. What goes in must come out? Bernard burst out laughing. You win. Oscar vaulted over the top of the bench and settled next to Branka. What did you think of this story? I think that you were uncomfortable when they spoke of the master. Oscar narrowed his eyes. I meant, what did you think of this story's moral, or what did you think the moral is? I know what you meant. Oscar swiped a potato from her plate and popped it in his mouth. For just a second he chewed, then he opened his mouth and breathed. This is really hot, really, really hot. Branka slid her napkin out from under her plate. Here, spit it out before you burn off your taste buds. Mama Cook made cream tarts for dessert. You don't want to miss that. Oscar closed his mouth and chewed while his head shook side to side. Tears streamed down the sides of his face. Stubborn, Branka tossed the napkin at him. He swallowed hard, then opened his mouth again. His breath was like a wave from a fanned fire. My throat is hotter than the forge, and I can no longer feel my tongue, but it was worth it. I conquered the potato. Stubborn, Branka said again, spearing a cube to blow on and show him how it should have been done. I prefer to think of it as dedicated, diligent, determined. Branka could think of a great many other words that started with D to describe him, but she decided to let it go. You know, when they speak of the master, they mean your father, not you. Everyone here sees you as one of us. I know. Then why are you bothered? Jane burst out laughing across the fire. Branka and Oscar were momentarily distracted by Bernard and Leaf as they pretended to eat like fine ladies. Branka had never seen fine ladies eat. She was generally relegated to the kitchen with Mama Cook during dinner parties, and she would never go so far as to call any of Oscar's sisters fine or ladies. Accurate or not, the two boys, with their backs straight, legs crossed, pinkies raised, and mouths pinched, were too funny for words. Branka did her share of laughing, but she refused to forget what she and Oscar had been talking about before the interruption. Why? She nudged him. Why what? Why does it bother you when people speak of the master? Branka rolled her eyes. And you call me stubborn? Because it's true. Perhaps it's true because I spend so much time with you. Ha! Branka reached for the place under Oscar's arm where he was most ticklish spot hid. Oscar grabbed her hand and held it up in the air. Don't you dare. I won't, I promise. She tried to tug her hand away, but Oscar's grip was too strong. She stopped pulling, knowing he would let her go when he was good and ready. You promise because you know that I know where to tickle you until you cry. Is that why? Yes, Branka nodded with gusto. That is a very good reason not to try to tickle you any more or ever again. Oscar looked at her hand and let it go quickly. Good, then we are understood. Quite, except that you still have not answered my question. Oscar sighed, his head lowering with the weight of his thoughts. Do you really want to know the answer to that question? His sudden shift in mood made Branka pause to consider. It must not be a happy answer if Oscar's behavior was any judge, but he was her dearest, oldest friend. If something was bothering him, then of course she wanted to know. Yes. Oscar turned so that he faced Branka, his fingers twitching against his leg. My father called me into his study yesterday. He has decided to pass the title to me in 6 months. That gives him time to turn the accounts over and teach me all there is to know about running the manor. Branka didn't quite see the problem, though she was admittedly looking at it from a different perspective than his own. She would much rather serve Oscar as the lord than as father. That sounded infinitely more bearable. What will he do when he has passed the title to you? Branka asked to help him along, as Oscar made no move to speak again on his own. Whatever he wants, Oscar waved. He grants himself freedom and myself slavery with one fell swoop. Branka knew something of slavery. You don't want to be Lord Fitzgerald? Branka. Oscar's eyes were haunted. Can Lord Fitzgerald gab with the servants? Can he muck out the barn and assist the blacksmith? Can he snitch biscuits from Mama Cook? Well, perhaps that last one. Branka doubted even the great lord himself could resist Mama Cook's biscuits fresh from the oven. When I am lord, I will no longer be Oscar. Do you see? My whole life will change. It will be dictated by every social whim, and that is not all. The Lord also informed me that my mother has found a suitable match. It took Branka a moment to realize what he meant. A wife? Oscar closed his eyes for a moment. A Lady Carmichael from the court. I haven't met her, but my sisters can't say enough of her grace and beauty. Branka swallowed hard, her stomach twisted around the food she'd already eaten. She'd known this day was coming. Of course she'd known. She'd just thought they had more time. It would take some getting used to, that was all. Even as she told herself this, images of a beautiful woman floating around the manor in silken skirts and satin slippers began to haunt her mind. At that moment, she knew she would never get used to a new Lady Fitzgerald, not if that meant the lady was Oscar's wife. Branka put her plate to the side, her appetite officially ruined. Oscar was right to round his shoulders as though he carried the weight of the world. This would be the end of everything. If only tonight would last forever, she murmured to herself, trying to stop the tears that were gathering in the corners of her eyes. You see now, don't you? Oscar's voice was laced with pain. You see why I'm bothered. What good was it that she understood? There was nothing either of them could do to stop it. Now this would hang over them like a wasp nest, delivering stings until it broke open and unleashed a whirlwind of continuous pain. Well, Branka took his hand. No matter what happens, I will always be your friend. My friend? Oscar's eyes bored into her. Branka dropped his hand. It was suddenly hot, unbearably hot in the kitchen. She scooted away from him and away from the fire. You should go get some supper before Bernard eats it all. Branka? Go on. She couldn't bear to look at him. Hurry, the food will get cold. He went, but she could feel his eyes on her as he walked away. She had to think of something else, or the swirl of her thoughts would drive her mad. What had they been talking about before this horrible realization? The moral of Drake's story. She latched onto this like a rope thrown down a deep, dark well. There were probably many morals in the story. Don't trust fairies. They will always trick you. Accept your life as it is. Don't wish without thinking it through. Her mind claimed this thought and would not let it go. What would she do with 3 wishes? Oh, what would she do?